All right, here we go. Yeah, it's preparing.
Okay.
Oh, Bujun Dinaway Mark and a dog. Was our Benes in the goo, Mako and Do Dame Bower Ting and Do Jaba. Hello, everyone. My name is Wayne Soames. I am the tribal liaison here at MAHUBE-OTWA Community Action Partnership. And today I'm extremely excited to introduce our guest for the day. And our topic is tribal sovereignty and history. And before I do introduce our guest, if you have any questions throughout the course of the talk, please put those in the Facebook chat there, and we'll at the end of our hour there, we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I'm extremely excited to announce that we have Anton Troyer here, who is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and author of many books. He has a Bachelor of Arts from Princeton University and a Master's and PhD from the University of Minnesota. Troyer is a member of the governing boards for the Minnesota State Historical Society and Waduko Dading Ojibwe Language Institute, and has received many prestigious awards and fellowships, including ones from the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation, the Bush Foundation, the First Nations Development Institute, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. In 2018, he was named Guardian of Culture and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. His equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path of service around the nation and world. Miigwech be'ejayan omaje gagigadoya and Dr. Troyer.
Aha, Chimigwech. Really appreciate the opportunity to be in community with all of you. And for those who are joining us via the Facebook live stream, it's nice to be in conversation with you all. Kwe maji tayan niwi Ojibwe majina mietago duwinda munugug awian wagosh indigu minawa migizi indo dame kazagasquaji mekog indun jiba minawa indanuki oma bemijigamag gabega kendasa wigamigung. I'm going to use a little English too. I'm almost at the point where I've got the president and deans at Bemidji State University where I work convinced that when someone calls and asks for the Department of Foreign Languages, to send them to the English department. And if someone needs anything else, they can come see me. I'm excited for the conversation today. I've done some work with MAHUBE before, different kinds of training on diversity, equity, inclusion. This session is really designed to have me put on my professor hat and speak a little bit more about tribal sovereignty, how that functions and works and intersects with people's lanes of work. Also, to think about some of the topics that are popping up today related to that. Just over the past few weeks, there have been land back requests from the Red Lake Nation and from White Earth. And I think there's a lot of confusion about some of those topics. So this session is really designed to kind of build up our understanding of Native nations, how they work, and some of the issues that intersect with them. And then really, we're going to hold space for questions and answers too. And you can kind of steer me in the directions that are most useful to you. I do have information that I'll be sharing on a PowerPoint for some of the time. In the chat, I've also dropped a link to my website because an hour is a really short amount of time. And ultimately, I don't know what it was like for you going to school, but when I did, I got a sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus in the first Thanksgiving and not a lot else to more deeply understand the first people of the land. And so even for Indigenous people, I mean, I knew what it was like living in this body and in this place, but the details of our history and sovereignty would have been difficult for me to explain finishing high school or something like that. And whatever I do know now is stuff that I primarily acquired later, excuse me, later on in life. All right. So let's try this, see how this works. All right. Let me know if you're not seeing that. I intentionally have this set up in presenter mode where you can kind of see what's coming next, just so it'll enable me to jump around a little bit through some of the different different topics here. But as we get started, I wanted to first just share a little story about something that happened, which in my view kind of demonstrates a little bit about, Native nationhood, how it functions, and what's important for a lot of Native nations. So, first of all, this is just a picture of some of our Jedi Council, so to speak, respected elders and mentors from Mille Lacs in central Minnesota. And I was brought to a meeting in Mille Lacs. This was probably a couple years before the pandemic. And they said, we have some overages from grants and also some other funds that we've designated to think about workforce development, helping people get jobs and be on their own feet and independent. But we want to think about this not just with a Western context. We want to think about this in our own language and culture context. So instead of just training them for service level jobs so they can be a responsible employee at a gas station, how can we equip them so that they can learn jobs related to our language and our culture? And I said, well, how much money are you talking about spending on this kind of effort? And they said, well, we have about $14 million. So I almost spit my teeth out. And at that point, they had done an Indigenous language survey in Mille Lacs, and they had identified only 25 remaining fluent first speakers of the Ojibwe language. And there were other speakers who were kind of emerging second language learners and things like that, but only 25 first speakers. And there's quite a few of them right here in this picture. And they were all elders over 70 years old. I said, it's not realistic to send them all to college and have them get teaching jobs and send them back to your community to run an immersion school or something like that. I think you're going to have to take a different approach. I said, how about we develop some resources that have lasting value? You're a sovereign nation. You can kind of chart your own path in this area. And I said, how about books for emerging readers that are entirely in our language and authored by your elders? How about the development of Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe language instruction? And through the course of developing these things, we will be teaching Mille Lacs citizens how to publish books, how to transcribe and translate, how to use technology applications, work with video, all kinds of different things. And they said, well, this sounds really good. Let's do all of it. And the work began. And we had so many interesting things happen. The elders were so dedicated. We produced the first 5 books for this effort. And we actually convinced the Minnesota Historical Society Press to publish the books, even though no one on their staff could read them. I was kind of proud of that one. And they've been doing really well. We started working on Rosetta Stone. And as we started this work, back to the picture of the elders, some of the lols, little old ladies, this is Carol Nickerboin right here. We had a session, the pandemic hit, so we had to send all of the elders home with a computer and a grandchild who was in their COVID bubble and teach them how to do work in an entirely different way. I called Carol one time, we had a session, and she said, oh, Tagish Wago Shingi Wanendan. She said, I forgot we were supposed to do work. Ajangi Bizi Kan Babizi Kawagan Tage Bagamigong Nuisha. I already put my coat on. I was heading to the casino. I said, casino? There's a pandemic. You're supposed to stay home and stay healthy. And she said, well, the language is more important. She takes off her coat and we start working. Work for a couple hours. And then she goes, well, going to the casino now. My niece has been waiting in the car the whole time. That was just kind of how dedicated the elders were. As we went through and worked through the pandemic, the Rosetta Stone is pretty cool. It uses video, it uses audio, It uses artificial intelligence so it can correct pronunciation and grammar as you interact with the application in real time. It pushes to an app on a smartphone, and that means the language can go wherever the people go instead of just in a couple of isolated places. And as the work began, we lost 6 of the 25 fluent speaking elders in Mille Lacs during the course of the pandemic. That's a little over 20% of the fluent speakers that passed away during the pandemic. That was pretty tough. As we came through this and eventually published the first 2 years of Rosetta Stone, year 3 will be published soon, and there'll be another year every year until we have a full 6-year development. It's been pretty amazing to see what has happened. Eventually, it got safe enough to convene people again and celebrate the books. And Rosetta Stone, Joe Naquinabe, who's a really respected elder in Mille Lacs, one of their ceremonial drum chiefs, he said, he had lost a sister and a brother during the pandemic. And I thought he would just say this is just the toughest time. But he kind of floored me when he got up and he said, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot the past few years, and we've been through a lot the past few hundred years. But I have to say, seeing all of the young people coming around, seeing what we've been able to equip our citizens to do, knowing that our elders will be teaching people our language for hundreds of years to come, I have to say that this has been the happiest time of my life. And it was a reminder to me that, well, those who didn't get the privilege of having their language handed to them on a silver platter hunger for it so much. Our elders, in equal measure, hunger to be able to share everything that they know, and that there's healing for everybody when we embark in this kind of work. As an application of sovereignty, the Mille Lacs Band could turn around and say, everyone who works for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe has a privilege. We are a sovereign nation. We expect all employees for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe to demonstrate this level of competency in our tribal language. And here is the tool to do it with the assessment built right in. You have 1 year from your date of hire. And so the use of language and culture is an application of sovereignty, nationhood, and empowerment. And it's just one example to give you a sense for how some of these things work. So I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit in this PowerPoint just to show you a couple of things. I'll give you a very brief introduction to myself, and then I want to spend a chunk of time just talking about tribal sovereignty and how it functions and works, just to help people understand the mechanics of that, and then some of the related topics to that. As we get into questions, you can kind of steer me in other directions. So there's home for me. Sometimes it surprises people as we think about our shared space and history. But I've got folks in my family tree, that John Smith, who had lived in parts of 3 centuries. And I never had ways to talk about this when I was younger, but it bothered me more as I got older that I could go to school for 13 years in a row to learn what I needed to be successful in the world. And so little of it had anything to do with me. It was kind of like the absent narratives were screaming, you and yours aren't important, relevant, they don't matter. And it caused issues. But it sometimes surprises people because I show up kind of brown, and I've got some beadwork on today and braids. Well, I guess it's a man bun. So I look native, or at least racially ambiguous. But my father was not native at all. He was born in Vienna, Austria, and spoke only German the first 13 years of his life. And he was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He has an amazing story of his own. It's a little beyond the scope of our talk today. But eventually, he made it to America, served in the U.S. Army towards the end of World War II, made his way to Minnesota. He met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up in the little village of Bena, population 400. About half of the village are my cousins, and that's not even an exaggeration. I think for her, she had a pretty visceral experience with poverty when she was younger. And she was born in the Cass Lake Indian Hospital on the Leech Lake Res. She was actually an enrolled member at White Earth, in spite of living at Leech Lake. Her dad was enrolled at Leech, her mother at White Earth. And even though she was born on the res, raised on the res, went to school on the res, by the time she was 18, she had only met one professional Native American person ever. That meant that all of the reservation schools were staffed with white educators. The police force there was all white. All of the bankers, all of the, administrators, and so forth. The only professional Native person she ever met, and this is on a reservation with a, tribal enrollment of about 9,000 people. The only one she met was the school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. And so she finished high school and went to nursing school and came back. One of her first jobs was working for our tribe's health program. And she thought, even here, Natives are getting pushed around. I'm going to do something about that. She went back to school and got a law degree. And she became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. So when I was a kid going to school, she'd bring me with her to court and she'd say, you just sit there and don't say a word. So, I'd sit there and not say a word. And I couldn't remember her court cases very well. But what I really remember is she was the only woman in court. And she and her law partner, Paul Day, were the only Natives in court. And I came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. And that was a very powerful lesson. We just had the retirement celebration for Paul Day. And I had to tell him that he was the first Native American man I ever saw doing anything professional. And at that time, this is just a couple months ago, we were in a room full of Native American professionals, judges, lawyers, social workers, and educators. And it was a powerful message that we have come so far, but we still have a lot further to go. There's more to say about both of my parents and their journeys, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and share a little bit more about some things going on in tribal sovereignty space. So one thing is first of all, just with regard to our communities and Native nations, there are a lot of misunderstandings. One is there's this stereotype that Native people are all living in squalor on a reservation. The reality is that, first of all, we're not even all on reservations. 50% of the enrolled citizenry lives off reservation. 70% of the self-identified Native population lives off reservation. And our economic landscape is actually pretty complex. So tribal economies, tribes employ 1.1 million people in the United States, pay out $49.5 billion in employee compensation, have 127 billion that should be net economic output. And even just the budget for the Cherokee Nation alone was $3.8 billion. So, be nice to Natives. You'll probably end up working for one someday. And at the same time, we have had experiences with terrible oppression and economic disadvantage. This, to me, is a pretty telling little data set. If you look at 1969, 57% of the Native population was below the poverty line. That's over half. By the time you skip forward to 2020, you got around 23% of the Native population below the poverty line. And it tells you two things. One of the things it tells you is that if 23% of a population is below the poverty line, that's gross, that's unacceptable, that's an indictment on America and its values, not on like the work ethic of Native people. At the same time, it also tells you that we just shaved 34 percentage points off of Indigenous poverty, which is the fastest growth rate out of poverty for any group in the country. If you want to do something to disrupt systemic intergenerational poverty, ask Indigenous people and Native nations. They have the best track record for doing exactly that. So instead of approaching Native communities with, paternalism and a sense of charity. I'm going to help those poor people. Approaching it with a view to, what do I need to know? How can I understand? How did they do that? This is amazing. And I have these things that I learned and want to share and can contribute to efforts to make this world and Native communities within this world a better place. There are many other ways to look at, advantages and disadvantages experienced by Native people and tribes. And what I'd like to do is share just a little bit about kind of structure for Native nations, which will explain a few things that a lot of us are dealing with. So this is complex. We could spend, a couple semesters at a university trying to explain all of the different dimensions and nuances to tribal sovereignty. But for starters, I'll say this. Native nations existed for thousands of years prior to the birth of the United States of America. Native nations continued to exist after the birth of the United States of America and continue to exist yet today. And in the United States, initial structure, there's a lot of attention to Native people. I don't know how many of you will remember your 9th grade civics class when they talked about the Federalist Papers and things like that. But there was this debate about how much power should go to the federal government, how much reserved for states. And ultimately, although they defined certain limited federal powers, an army for the common defense, a system of taxation and laws, that almost everything else was reserved for states. So, for example, the US federal government initially did not say that murder is not okay. Each state said murder's not okay. And that's why some states, like Texas, have a death penalty, and others, like Minnesota, do not. It is state law, not federal law, that governs such things. In fact, most of our lives are more governed by state laws than federal laws. Marriage, divorce, all of the civil laws are state laws. Most of the criminal code is state law. And so, we can see how big and how powerful the federal government is because it operates an army. But ultimately, most of our lives are governed by state laws. Now, Native nations. Native nations are not state governments. They're independent governments. And in the US Constitution, there are a couple of places where natives are mentioned specifically. One is the Trade and Intercourse Clause. So this part of the US Constitution says only Congress, and this means only the United States federal government, its Congress, shall regulate trade and manage affairs between the several states and various Indian tribes. In other words, dealing with natives is a federal responsibility, not a state responsibility or right. And that ends up being quite significant. One of the first big tests comes in the 1830s. This is an image of John Marshall, who is a Supreme Court justice and wrote the opinion in a couple of these really important cases. I'm not going to take you too much into the detail of the cases, just as a matter of time, and because this isn't really a legal seminar. But in the cases, they all, one way or another, revolved around the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee were a large and powerful nation in the American Southeast, comprising most of what's now the state of Georgia, parts of North Carolina, and other neighboring states. And the Cherokee never had a war or military encounter fighting against the Americans. And so when the state of Georgia wanted them relocated out of there so they could take all of their land, the Cherokee objected and said, look, we are not your enemies. We are your friends. We have not killed any of you. We are not seeking to do so. We should not be held as prisoners of war because we've never had a war with you. And did the equivalent of filing for an injunction and saying, state of Georgia has no authority to relocate us. And these cases, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Cherokee won their cases. The U.S. Supreme Court looked at the law, and the law said that state governments do not have control over Native nations. Only the US federal Congress can deal with Native nations. And furthermore, another part of the US Constitution says, quote, treaties are the supreme law of the land. So when there's a treaty between two nations, then that law reigns supreme. If that is, a treaty at the end of World War II that says Japan will surrender unconditionally to the United States of America, and America promises to provide for the security of Japan, that is considered binding on both. And the same is true with treaties made with Native nations. Now, in spite of what these court cases said, Andrew Jackson, who is president of the United States, said, the US Supreme Court made their decision. Let them enforce it. Hey, Georgia, go ahead, move those little red devils anyway. And they were sent off on a trail of tears. It's technically trails of tears because there were multiple waves of forced migration. It was brutal. Over 4,000 people died. The Cherokee, who had, integrated, and modernized their economy, had built, two-story houses and stuff, were evicted from their homes, and white settlers came in and claimed ownership of those homes for free. For that, Andrew Jackson probably should have been impeached rather than put on your $20 bill. Of course, that's not what happened. Within those rulings, there was some contradictory language where, although the Cherokee had technically won their legal case, but been forced to move anyways, John Marshall used this term, domestic dependent nation, and kind of paternalistic language, that these Native nations are nations, but they are dependent on the United States like little red children to their great white father. So it's kind of offensive and problematic, but the law did say what the law said. In spite of that, America has a history of violating its own laws, especially in the Indian business. All right. Then you get Manifest Destiny. This is kind of a famous painting that depicts that, the buffalo disappear, the natives disappear, and all the progress comes. Railroads, stagecoaches, farmers, Christianity, and this is kind of like what America's all about. Even the Oklahoma land rushes did not just happen on native land, they happened inside of the reservations to which they had already relocated numerous people. So there were so many takings and injustices in spite of what the law actually said. Well, in many ways, tribal sovereignty didn't get a lot of tests until a little bit later. When you look around today, you will see that Native nations exercise sovereignty. They may keep their own license plates. They operate casinos, like in a state such as Minnesota, where gaming and gambling is illegal, except for Powerball, pull tabs, and church bingo. And so essentially, because Native nations are nations and are not under the purview of state authority, and most of our lives are governed by state authority, ultimately, tribes have a lot more power than a lot of people even realized, even tribal people, until some of this stuff was tested. So I'll flash forward to later in the 1800s, and these are pictures on the left of crow dog, and on the right, Sinteglishka, which is spotted tail. And, just for a tiny bit of background, excuse me, in 1868, there had been a 4-year war from 1864 to 68, where the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had fought against the United States and won, defeating the US Army in the field, forcing the abandonment of 3 major forts in Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho territory, and a huge swath of territory that comprised most of 5 US states, which would be unceded land where a white person needed written permission to enter. It was a major victory for the tribes, signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. Now, afterwards, the victorious tribes many of the leaders, including Red Cloud, Spotted Tail, and others, just assumed that America, which had signed this treaty, would honor it. But of course, they didn't. There was gold discovered in the Black Hills. You get Crazy Horse, Custer, Sitting Bull, and that kind of history. When that happened, there was a big split in the Lakota Nation. And some, like Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, said, we will never fight again because the United States government agreed that they would not violate our territory. And they just couldn't understand that America would break its own word. And so there was a heavy price paid for that, obviously. There were others, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and Crow Dog, who really felt differently. And they were very upset with their own leaders, called them Hang Around the Fort Indians. And Crow Dog walked up to Spotted Tail one day, pulled out a gun, and killed him, shot him in cold blood. And the murder of Spotted Tail was handled according to Lakota custom. So Crow Dog was ordered to pay restitution, horses, blankets, things like that. And then to provide for Spotted Tail's widow and minor children. And then Crow Dog and his family had to live in exile from the community at Rosebud, not for a year or two, but for 4 whole generations. So Crow Dog, his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren all had to live in exile. In fact, Leonard Crow Dog was the 4th generation of Crow Dogs living in exile from the community at Rosebud. And so they were some miles away from the community, but would go back to the community to offer provisions for Spotted Tail's family. Over the years, it rehabilitated the relationship between Spotted Tail and Crow Dog families who are connected, even intermarried, and love each other dearly. So it was an exercise in restorative justice over a grievous murder. That was according to Lakota custom. However, U.S. officials were really upset. What? This guy just killed one of our good Indians. He's getting away with the red man's revenge. So they arrested Crow Dog. They charged him with murder, and he was tried in what was at the time Dakota Territorial Court. So it was before North and South Dakota became states, and sentenced to hang. Crow Dog then did something very interesting. He lawyered up and he appealed his case, and he won his case on appeal, where the court said, and Crow Dog, by the way, did not say, I didn't kill him. He said, I killed him. His defense was, you don't have authority to try me for murder. This was handled according to my tribal custom. And because you are a state government and your own constitution says only the federal government has authority over tribes, that's that. And so he won his case because the court justices had to look at the U.S. Constitution. No one had changed the Constitution or passed other laws that would infringe upon tribal sovereignty. So they let him go. Crow Dog lived to be an old man. He's still kind of a hero, as actually is Spotted Tail in Lakota communities today. Immediately afterwards, American officials, still really upset with what had happened to Spotted Tail, used the federal government to pass new legislation. They passed something called the Major Crimes Act. And they said, if only the U.S. federal Congress can do something to tribal sovereignty, you're darn right we will. And so the Major Crimes Act said, in cases of murder, rape, and then the other crimes, initially there were 7 of them. The other 5 were all property crimes, arson, larceny, so forth. That in these cases, the U.S. federal government will assume jurisdiction over tribes. And that is still active law in the United States today. It's been amended many times, so the list of offenses has grown. If some of you might remember, for example, the 2005 school shooting at Red Lake, who investigated was not the county sheriff's department, it was the FBI. If that shooting had taken place right off the reservation, it would have been your county agencies that would have investigated under state law. So the Major Crimes Act started to change things, and it asserted federal jurisdiction over a limited number of major crimes. And there had been like this effort to really control tribes and tribal people where they appointed a white Indian agent and sent him to each reservation. They had their own police force and their own court system called Courts of Indian Offenses. And they used those auspices to arrest people for participating in a dance, a powwow, or a ceremony. There are people at Red Lake, for example, who were, did a year's hard labor for going to a medicine dance. And so the oppressions of religious freedom were pretty gross. By the way, some of those things were in place until they didn't recall the Indian agents until 1934. And it wasn't until the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act that some of these issues were more thoroughly and properly addressed. So it says something actually about the weakness of the US Constitution, like the First Amendment is freedom of religion, speech, and assembly. Natives had been citizens in the United States since 1924. So if the US Constitution was not sufficient to protect the religious freedom of US citizens, that means that anyone's religious freedoms could be trampled. And so ultimately, we got a lot of work to do. And it is about the Native experience, but it is also about everyone's rights. For most of the lives of most of the kids in America today, there will not be a racial majority group. We're seeing big shifts in the demography with regards to religious affiliation and stuff like that too. America's becoming increasingly secular, and the numbers of people in a variety of denominations are actually decreasing relative to their percentage in the population today. So ultimately, there's some bigger ramifications too, even beyond the tribal sovereignty ones. But as this happened, like there's more than one way to skin a cat, and they kind of found the ways. So there were efforts to chip away at tribal sovereignty. The Major Crimes Act was one example. And by the way, another one, in the 1950s, they passed something called Public Law 280. So a super bureaucratic sounding law. This was also federal legislation. And that legislation would give state governments control over criminal jurisdiction, but only in certain states. It did include Minnesota and Wisconsin, but when they passed the law here in Minnesota, you get some complications. So Red Lake said, look, we don't want to be under state law. We object. We've already been working to establish our own tribal government, which they had organized in 1918. They had actually converted the old, Indian courts of Indian offenses that were used to suppress our religious freedom and started asserting some tribal control over those. And they said, we can manage our own affairs. So Red Lake was exempted from Public Law 280. And later on in 1975, the Boys Fort Reservation was also exempted from Public Law 280. Here's what that means today. If you go to the White Earth Reservation, or any of the reservations other than Red Lake and Boys Fort, if somebody commits a murder, it will be investigated with a state law enforcement agency, usually through a county sheriff's department. And if there is a murder at Red Lake or Boys Fort, the FBI will handle the investigation. So you have different agencies depending on which jurisdiction you are in. By the way, it does cause a variety of problems. So for the most part, the truth in sentencing guidelines in federal court systems are much more strict and have less room for variation than in states. As a result, for the same crime, people at Red Lake and Boys Fort will actually do more time than they would if the crime had been committed a mile away off the reservation. Also, we have issues with regard to representation in juries. So I don't know how many of you have ever been called up for jury duty. I have, but how they determine who gets called up for jury duty in most of Minnesota is that they look at two forms of data. One is property records. Who owns land? And when you pay your property taxes, your name is in the county registry, and that's a pool they pull on for jury representation. Now, at Red Lake, among other things that differentiate that particular reservation, is they were never subjected to the policy of allotment. Allotment is a policy where they took reservation lands, which were held in trust for the benefit of all tribal members, chopped them up into individual parcels, and each head of household got a land allotment. At Red Lake, they never did allotment. All of the land, even today, is still held in trust for the benefit of all tribal members. But among the things that means is, if no one at Red Lake owns their own private land parcel at Red Lake, then they're not in the pool for prospective jury duty. And the US Constitution provides that everyone is entitled to a trial by their peers. I've sat or been called up for jury duty a couple of times. I've never sat on a jury. And what happens is this: they pull it in a pool. When I was brought there were 40 people in a pool. And then, they pull everybody into a room and they say, does anybody know the defendant? If you do, you get to go home. And if you don't, you got to stay. And then they'll say, does anyone have a, conflict of interest or a reason that might prejudice you? And if you do, you're excused. And then each attorney for each side takes a look at the jury pool and asks a few questions, and they say, you, and you can go home. So if someone has a Native person who is, being charged with a crime, then the prosecuting attorney typically looks at the jury pool, picks the brown people, and says, you can go home. So I don't know how often a Native person has Native people on the jury that actually convict them. I think it's very uncommon. If a white person's charged with a crime, there will be white people on the jury. And so that's just another dimension of kind of the legalese that is affecting things. Other issues that pop up include jurisdictional ones where tribes have jurisdiction over their own tribal members, but they do not have jurisdiction over everybody else. So most crime in America is white on white, black on black, and so forth, but crimes of sexual violence directed at Native women are predominantly perpetrated by white men. So if a white man was coming onto a reservation and perpetrating a crime on a Native woman, and the tribe has no jurisdiction over that person, then they can prey with impunity. And it is one of the issues that was fueling the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and why special attention and advocacy has to be paid there. The data sets reveal that Native women are victimized more often, especially in crimes of sexual violence, and that they have most of the perpetrators from outside of their own group, racial group. So there's been an effort to address this with the Violence Against Women Act. That legislation has, for when it was first founded, needed constant reauthorization by Congress. And Congress would often refuse to reauthorize the legislation, which seems like a no-brainer, which would address this jurisdictional gap. And the reason they would is because over political purposes, some people were opposed to anything that would support or enhance tribal sovereignty because they were worried that tribes would use their sovereignty to fight fossil fuel extraction or pipelines. Now, the most recent iteration of VAWA doesn't have a sunset clause, so it looks like it's a little bit stronger than it was before. But I'm sure that the fight over this particular piece of legislation is not entirely concluded. So it's a little bit about Violence Against Women Act. The other things that you may see pop up, and I want to make sure that I hold some space for your questions, so we'll be opening it up in just a little bit. But they include some of the calls for land back, and I can speak to that for a couple of minutes. Also things like, Indian Child Welfare Act, and these things directly intersect with some of the work that folks at MAHUBE and other places are doing. So I'll give just a minute or two on each, and then we'll start taking your questions. I'll drop the PowerPoint now just so we can kind of see each other a little better. And I'll speak briefly to land back, and then a little bit to the Indian Child Welfare Act, and then we'll just start taking questions. All right. So with regard to land back, there have been so many historical injustices. And one thing that I think is not well understood by people really on any side of it is that the United States of America does not have a legal precedent for taking someone's private land away from them and giving it to someone else. The only thing that does have a legal precedent is like, whatever, if the federal government's putting an interstate highway through, they can take your front yard, but then they have to pay you for it. But taking land from one private citizen and giving it to another citizen or entity, that has never happened. When there's been a historical injustice with regard to land, and there have been a number of these that have been litigated by tribes, essentially the court will determine if a treaty was violated and what the consequences were, and then they will end up writing a check. But if the tribe cashes the check, they've just authenticated, whoever else owns the land now. So those have been kind of unsatisfactory remedies. So there's been a call in recent years around land back. And land back is designed as a restorative justice model that we can't fix all of the things that went wrong, but we can explore a way to try to remedy some of these things the best way that we can. So when you look at Leech Lake, for example, natives own 4% of their own reservation at Leech Lake. And a couple years ago, there was a call for land back. And a lot of the Leech Lake Reservation is the Chippewa National Forest. So the US government agreed to repatriate an 11,000-acre parcel of the Chippewa National Forest, which would shift then from federal government stewardship to tribal stewardship. A lot of people don't realize this one either, but there's a big difference between national parks and national forests. So the Chippewa National Forest was regularly clear-cut by the United States federal government, and all of the proceeds kept by the United States federal government. When the tribe took stewardship of this 11,000-acre parcel, they said, we will not cut any old growth pine forests because a lot of our tribal members use those areas for harvesting of medicines and things like that. We will also not be cutting maple groves because we have tribal harvesters who want to be able to harvest maple. And furthermore, we will make sure that we steward this resource for environmental health, not for financial extraction. And so you actually had a better environmental outcome with the land under tribal stewardship than you did having it under US federal government stewardship. Furthermore, the other concerns that sometimes pop up, well, what about white guys who like to hunt there? Well, they still get to hunt there. The land is just stewarded by tribes. It did not impede someone else's use and access in that case. And sometimes people also come up with other arguments that really make no sense, like, oh, those natives, they'll never pay taxes on that. Well, it was federal land. No one has ever in the history of the world paid taxes on that land. So some of the arguments are kind of non sequiturs. Currently, there's an request for the repatriation of lands that are public lands over at White Earth to tribal stewardship, somewhat similar to what happened at Leech Lake. At Red Lake, you've got a little bit different issue where some of the lands there were excluded from the reservation boundary that should have been included in the reservation boundary because the original negotiation clearly indicated that Red Lake would keep all of the land around Lower and Upper Red Lake. They even took out a map and natives drew the lines before they would agree to sign. And later on, there was a different map that was put into the National Archives from a plat book that was published even a couple years after this event. So it couldn't have been the one that natives drew lines on and signed on. And so now you've got this chunk of Upper Red Lake cut off from the Red Lake Reservation. And, there are all kinds of tensions around it. Red Lake wants the reservation boundary redrawn in alignment with the agreement as originally understood. But it's not going to like kick all the white people out of there. That would just place some of the white-owned parcels inside of the Red Lake Reservation. And I think what justice would look like would be, repatriating the parcels that are publicly owned to tribal stewardship. And then, if white people who are living there for a few generations want to bequeath to their heirs, they may. And if they want to sell, they could only sell to the tribe, and the US government would appropriate money to cover land sales. So it wouldn't violate somebody's, ability to still stay there if they, have been living there, or even give it to their kids, but would still provide a pathway for Red Lake to get the land back that should have originally always been theirs. So that's just an example on the land back stuff. Wayne, you can start queuing up some questions, and I can provide a minute or two on Indian Child Welfare Act too. But why don't we see what's coming up in the questions real quick?
Absolutely. I'll read this one here to you, then I'll put a couple in the chat.
Okay.
So, regarding law enforcement, can you share your view on why the federal and state governments are seemingly unwilling to investigate the numerous cases of missing or murdered Indigenous women across the country? Is it due to territorial issues you described, like tribal and federal agencies, or simply a lack of caring about the lives of Native people?
That's a great question. I think it's probably a combination of issues, and sometimes it's a little different in different places. So one thing is there are efforts to create cooperative law enforcement approaches to addressing this issue. Red Lake has had a, gang and drugs task force. There's been an effort to create cooperative agreements at White Earth and Leech Lake. In Mille Lacs, the local law enforcement agencies have been really resistant to even having a conversation about it. And I think that has to do with, politics and misunderstandings about fish and stuff like that. So it's a little different in different places, but sometimes there's resistance to just working cooperatively. People are afraid of tribes or anything that would enhance tribal sovereignty. That's one dimension. But also, even in places where there are trying to build some sort of collective or cooperative agreement, these efforts are not properly resourced. So, on any given day at Red Lake, they have a police force, but there might be 2, maybe 4 officers that are patrolling, an area of the Red Lake Reservation that is larger than some states. They just can't deal with everything that is coming at them. And so it is difficult because if you just say, here's another $1 million for this law enforcement agency, it is more likely that those resources would be allocated towards buying weaponry than tasking people to solve missing and murdered Indigenous women's cases, or to provide training for de-escalation or things like that. So it's complex and it's kind of tense and testy. And, I think, people who are serving in law enforcement, putting their lives on the line to keep us safe every day deserve our respect. And at the same time, that is a profession like airline pilots where you can't get it right like 80% of the time and get an A+ grade. Like if airline pilots got the planes there 80% of the time and they crashed 20% of the time, no one would fly. And the problem is, and I'm not saying it's an 80% success rate, but like law enforcement usually gets it right, but sometimes they do not. And we have seen, especially in communities of color, what happens when it's not going right. George Floyd and things like that. And so there's a tension about you can't just throw money at the problem. It has to be allocated in certain ways. I do think that Native people have been treated with disrespect and disregard throughout history. And that is reflected in some of the responses. I do think that there's a lot of social activism and efforts to generate awareness around this, and it is starting to gain some traction. Um, I was at a MMIW event in Canada, and they must have had 30 police officers in uniform serving up the money for the spaghetti feed and handing out literature and trying to talk about doing things right. That was in Winnipeg. Of course, Winnipeg also had some Native women who had been dumped into a dump, and people were advocating not getting the bodies out because it would cost too much money to go through all of the trash at the landfill. Like how dehumanizing is that? You got both things happening. There is progress. There are steps forward. There are a lot of people who care, and there are some people who don't. And ultimately, I think more people care than don't. But what happens in our political agendas is sometimes another question. I can see we're going to have way more questions than we'll have time to deal with, but I'll try to tackle a couple.
So most of them are from me there. So could you touch on the one? Can you speak to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe and tribal sovereignty?
Yes. So Minnesota Chippewa tribe. So when you go back to like the treaty period, which established reservations, treaties weren't made with each reservation. The reservations were made by treaties, and people had village leaders, and the treaties were signed with like the Mississippi Band, and there'd be people from numerous different villages. As a result, a lot of the treaty claims, cases, timber fraud issues, and things that they were trying to resolve got pushed together as a group. And Red Lake successfully got themselves excluded from litigating all of these concerns together, in the 1920s and stuff like that. But all of the other tribes had so much shared treaty history and so much shared legal history that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe was established. And technically, that is the tribal entity, and each of the others are, members of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. It is a weird, kind of complex arrangement. Each of the tribe, like White Earth, Mille Lacs, and so forth, will really say we are our own independent sovereign nation. But when it comes to passing a budget or even changing things like tribal enrollment laws, you actually have to change the constitution for the Minnesota Chippewa tribe just so that you can change it, at a place like White Earth. So in a way, the idea of, dealing with everything collectively might have had some noble or practical origins, but it does hamper each tribe's ability to do its own thing. And so, you got tribes like, White Earth with 16,000 tribal members, and there's some others that are much smaller. Grand Portage only has a few hundred. Only a couple of the tribes are small enough where they could do a per capita payment, but sometimes they're resistant to changing tribal enrollment, because of that, and other reasons. And so it just gets complex. But I do think that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe could and more likely will eventually change its constitution to say, this entity will now delegate to the member tribes the authority to make their own tribal enrollment laws, and the MCT will only sanction those. But there will have to be some changes, especially around things like tribal enrollment. Grand Portage has only 80 children on the tribal rolls. That's it. Within 100 years, there'll be no tribal members left. So they must change tribal enrollment or they will cease to exist. And they can't because of the structure with the MCT right now. So there will have to be some changes. And it may take them a while, but I think eventually they'll get there.
All right. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for coming in today and talking about sovereignty, and just something I think we need in our communities, just that information and knowledge, because like you said, it's sugar coated throughout schooling, and something that as adults and community members we just lack still, especially communities like Detroit Lakes, Bemidji, those closer to ones, Walker, closer to the reservation. So yeah, Apajugo Miigwech. So and thank you.
Yeah, Miigwech Gagin. Appreciate everybody who's able to tune in. Sorry I didn't get to the Indian Child Welfare Act, but we can try to set another one up at some point in the future.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone out there in Facebook land and the internet for stopping in today and checking everything out. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
All right, miigwech.